There's a kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. You've probably felt it. That heaviness that doesn't come from doing too much, but from feeling too much. From absorbing a room the moment you walk into it. From carrying conversations home with you long after they've ended. Most people don't see it, because from the outside, you look fine. You function. You show up. You even smile at the right moments. But inside there's this constant hum. Like a frequency only you can hear. And nobody ever told you that was real, or that it mattered. They told you to toughen up, to not take things so personally, to stop overthinking, as if the way you experienced the world was a flaw that needed correcting. But here's what they missed. What most people still miss is that the depth of your feeling isn't a weakness you inherited. It's the architecture of who you are, and living at odds with that architecture. That's where the exhaustion really comes from. Think about what it actually costs to move through a world that wasn't built for your sensitivity. Every interaction requires a kind of translation. You notice what others don't, the shift in someone's voice, the pause before an answer, the way a person's eyes drift when they say "I'm fine." You feel those things, you absorb them, and then you're expected to just move on. Keep going, act like none of that happened inside you, so you learn to manage it. You develop this quiet performance, a version of yourself that is contained enough to be acceptable. You laugh a beat too late sometimes. You hold back opinions. You simplify yourself so others feel comfortable around you. And for a while, it works. But there's a cost to that kind of translation. There always is. Carl Rogers, one of the most important psychological minds of the 20th century, spent his life studying what happens when human beings are forced to live at a distance from their own experience. He called it incongruence, that gap between who you actually are, your real feelings, your real perceptions, your real reactions, and the version of yourself you present to the world to be accepted, loved, approved of. He didn't describe it as a moral failure. He described it as a very human response to an environment that made authenticity feel dangerous. And isn't that exactly what happened to you? Somewhere along the way, you learned that feeling deeply was too much. Maybe it was explicit. Someone told you directly that you were too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. Maybe it was subtler. The way a parent would shut down when you cried. The way your feelings were consistently redirected into logic, into humor, into silence. Children are extraordinarily good at reading what a space will and won't tolerate. So you adapted, you contracted, not because you chose to, but because some part of you needed to survive inside that environment. And here's the part that nobody talks about. That contraction doesn't stay in childhood. It comes with you. It becomes the way you sit in meetings, the way you move through friendships, the way you fall silent in moments when everything inside you is screaming to be heard. You carry it so naturally now that you've almost mistaken it for your actual self. If you've been walking around thinking "I'm just a quiet person" or "I just don't like conflict," I want to gently ask you, is that who you are? Or is that who you had to become? If something in that question landed differently than you expected, sit with it for a moment. You don't have to answer it right now. But if this channel has ever made you feel slightly more understood, slightly less alone in the way your inner world works, consider subscribing. Not for content, but for a space that takes your depth seriously. The exhaustion of feeling too deeply isn't just emotional, it's existential. Because the more you suppress your actual experience, the more disconnected you become from the only compass you were ever really given, your own sense of what is real, what matters, what hurts, and what feels true. Rogers called this your organismic valuing process. This inner system that, before the world got involved, was remarkably good at knowing what was nourishing and what wasn't. You had it as a child. Most people with deep sensitivity still do, but when it's been overridden enough times, when you've been told often enough that your reactions are wrong, you start to distrust it. You stop listening to yourself, and that's the real wound. Not the feeling of too much, but the belief that the feeling cannot be trusted. The belief that your internal experience is somehow disproportionate to reality. Embarrassing, something to be managed rather than inhabited. So you learn to edit yourself before anyone else can. You preemptively shrink. You make yourself legible. You translate the full, complex, textured thing you actually feel into something simpler, safer, more digestible. And somewhere in that translation, something gets lost. Something quietly grief-inducing. Though you might not have words for it yet, there's a particular loneliness that lives inside highly sensitive people. It's not the loneliness of being alone. You might be surrounded by people who genuinely love you. It's the loneliness of not being met, of having deep wells inside you that most conversations never reach, of saying something meaningful and watching it land flat, of simplifying your inner world so many times that you're no longer sure anyone knows, or could know, the full version of you. And sometimes you wonder if even you know it anymore. That's not a flaw in you. That's the cost of years of incongruence, of living slightly beside yourself instead of inside yourself. Rogers believed that psychological suffering wasn't primarily about trauma in the clinical sense. It was about this distance, this ongoing gap between the person you are and the person you've learned to perform. And he also believed something quietly radical, that given the right conditions, human beings don't just tolerate authenticity, they move toward it, almost naturally, almost inevitably, not through discipline, not through willpower, but through something closer to permission. Permission to stop translating, permission to be the full, inconvenient, deeply feeling version of yourself without it being an emergency. That's not an instruction. You can't manufacture permission from the outside. But sometimes, and this is what Rogers spent his career trying to understand, sometimes just being truly seen creates enough safety that something inside you begins to uncurl. A relationship, a space, a moment of real recognition. And in that moment, the contraction loosens slightly, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to remember that the thing underneath it is still there. If you've ever had a conversation where you didn't have to manage yourself, where you said the actual thing you meant, and the other person didn't look away, didn't redirect, didn't shrink from it, you know what I'm describing. That feeling of being received. It's almost shocking, isn't it? How unfamiliar it can feel to be simply held in your fullness, not fixed, not advised, just held. This is one of those moments where I want to pause and say, if any of this is resonating with something you rarely hear named out loud, leave a comment below. Tell me what this brought up for you. Your words matter in this space. And if this kind of exploration is something you want more of, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps more people who feel deeply find their way here. But here's what I want you to sit with. The exhaustion you feel, that bone deep, no sleep will fix it tired, is not because you're broken. It's because you've been doing a second job your whole life. A job nobody hired you for and nobody pays you for. The job of managing your own realness so that others stay comfortable. And that job has no days off. Rogers talked about what he called the fully functioning person. Not a perfect person. Not a person who has resolved all their inner conflict. A person who is open to their experience. Who doesn't spend energy fighting what they actually feel. Who doesn't meet their own inner life with judgment or correction before the experience has even finished happening. A person who has, slowly, learned to trust the signals coming from inside. That sounds simple. And for people who don't feel deeply, maybe it is. But for you, it might be the most radical thing imaginable. Because your whole relationship with your inner world has been shaped by the idea that it's too much. What would it actually mean to stop believing that? Not to become louder, not to perform your sensitivity or make it your identity, but just to stop spending energy on the containment. To let what you feel be real without immediately reaching for the volume control. And this is where it gets complicated, because the containment, the very thing that exhausts you, has also protected you. It was never just a bad habit. It was a strategy you developed when feeling too much in the wrong room had real consequences. When your tears made someone uncomfortable enough to leave. When your honesty made someone love you a little less visibly. When your depth made people call you intense like it was an accusation. So the containment made sense once. It kept you safe in spaces that couldn't hold you. The question isn't why you built it. The question is whether you're still living in those spaces, or whether you're carrying those walls into rooms that might actually be able to hold you now. There's a grief in recognizing that. because it means that some of the distance you've felt from people, some of the loneliness, the feeling of never quite being fully known, wasn't only because they weren't capable of meeting you. Sometimes they were, and you still held back, because the habit of protecting yourself had become so automatic that you couldn't find the door. That's not something to be ashamed of, but it is something worth seeing clearly. Rogers described something he called conditions of worth, the unspoken rules we absorb from our earliest environments that tell us, you are acceptable if, you are lovable when, you belong as long as. For people who feel deeply, those conditions almost always targeted the feeling itself. You are too much. You are acceptable if you quiet down. You belong as long as you make yourself easier to be around. And the devastating thing about conditions of worth is that they don't just shape your behavior, they shape your self-concept, the internal picture you carry of who you are and what you deserve. So you didn't just learn to contain yourself for others. You started to believe the container was you. You started to believe that the real thing, the feeling, expansive, perceptive, deeply moved thing underneath, was the problem, and that the performance was the solution. But a performance, sustained long enough, starts to hollow you out. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone notices, just quietly, gradually, like water leaving a glass drop by drop until one day you reach for it and find it nearly empty. And you don't even remember the last time you felt full. That moment of emptiness, that's usually when people start asking the harder questions. Not what should I do differently, but something deeper, something more like, who am I, actually, when I'm not managing how I'm perceived? It's a terrifying question, and an essential one, because the answer isn't something you can think your way to. It's something you have to feel your way back to slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of false starts and moments of doubt. There will be days when turning inward feels disorienting, when the silence is louder than the noise ever was, when you notice how unfamiliar your own unfiltered reactions feel. That discomfort isn't evidence that you're broken, it's evidence that you've been distant, and distance takes time to close. Rogers believed that the self is not a fixed thing. It's not a destination you arrive at after enough introspection. It's a process, an ongoing, unfolding relationship between who you are and who you're allowing yourself to become. And for people who feel deeply, that relationship is often the most neglected relationship in their lives. You give so much attunement to others, to their moods, their needs, their unspoken discomfort, and so little of that attunement to yourself. What if you turned even a fraction of that sensitivity inward? Not as a project, not as self-improvement, just as attention. The kind of attention you've always been capable of giving, directed, for once, toward your own inner life. At first, you might not find clarity. You might find contradiction, longing mixed with fear, tenderness mixed with anger. But that complexity is not a flaw, it's aliveness. The self isn't a clean narrative, it's layered. And learning to stay with those layers without immediately editing them is part of the becoming. What would you find there, do you think? Not the curated version you share, not the managed, translated, made for public version. The real thing. The thing that stirs when a piece of music does something unexpected. The thing that aches when a conversation ends before it really began. The thing that knows, immediately, viscerally, when something is wrong, when something is true, when something matters. That thing hasn't gone anywhere. It's been waiting, quietly, underneath all the management. There's something worth naming about the way deeply feeling people often relate to beauty, art, music, literature. The particular quality of light on a late afternoon, a sentence in a book that makes you put it down and stare at the ceiling. These things hit you differently than they hit most people. They always have, and there's a reason for that. Your nervous system isn't filtering as aggressively. You're letting more in, more texture, more resonance, more meaning. That can feel overwhelming, but it is also an extraordinary capacity. It means your life has access to nuance, to subtleties others rush past, to moments that would otherwise dissolve unnoticed. That's not a glitch. That's the same capacity that makes you feel pain more acutely, also making you feel wonder more completely. The cost and the gift are inseparable, and maybe that's the reframe that matters most. Not that you need to become less sensitive, Not that you need to develop thicker skin or higher tolerance or better emotional regulation, as if you were a system with a bug that needed patching, but that the same openness that exhausts you is also the thing that makes your life, at its fullest moments, genuinely alive in a way that more defended people rarely experience. You've been paying the price of sensitivity your whole life. Have you ever let yourself fully receive the gift of it? There is courage in allowing yourself to be impacted, in admitting that something moved you, in choosing honesty over composure, even in small ways. That courage doesn't always look bold. Often, it looks like staying present instead of shutting down. It looks like saying, "That mattered to me," without apologizing for it. There's a kind of becoming that Rogers described not as achievement, but as process. He called it becoming a person, not arriving, not fixing, not finally getting it right. Just the ongoing, imperfect, deeply human act of moving closer to who you actually are. For people who feel deeply, that movement often begins with a very quiet recognition. The recognition that the depth wasn't the problem. The distance from the depth, that was the problem. And maybe you already knew that somewhere inside you. Maybe that's exactly why this video found you. There's something important about the fact that you're here, that you're asking these questions, that you haven't given up on understanding yourself even when understanding yourself has been exhausting. That impulse, that refusal to become completely numb, is itself a form of aliveness. Don't let anyone convince you it's a burden. If something here stayed with you, a phrase, an image, a moment of quiet recognition, let that sit rather than chase it. Some insights don't arrive in words, they arrive later. In the middle of a conversation or a drive home, when something clicks and you think, "Oh, that's what it was." Trust that. Your inner life has always known more than you've been given credit for. And if this space feels like somewhere your depth is welcome, subscribe, leave a like, and stay close. There's more of this here. Slow, honest, unhurried exploration of what it means to be human at full volume. You belong here. The quiet exhaustion will not last forever. Not because it disappears, but because slowly, with enough safety, enough permission, enough gentle contact with your own truth, the energy you've been spending on distance starts to come home. And when it does, you may notice something subtle but profound. A steadiness that doesn't rely on approval, a softness that doesn't require shrinking, a presence that feels less like effort and more like alignment. What remains isn't loud, it's not dramatic, it's just you, finally a little less at war with yourself, and that is what rest actually feels like.